Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. So this week, we are going to jump in on the form critics, and probably something you've never heard of, a group of people you've never heard of. We're going to jump back over 100 years ago, and we're going to look at where a lot of the modern skeptics get a lot of the ideas that you find that are very popular online. You'll hear Bart Ehrman talk about some of these things. You'll hear lots of people online talking about some of these ideas. And I want to talk about tonight where that comes from and where we get some of these ideas from. Before we get there, I want to start with some basic premises that I think will help us in all of this, because the ideas from the form critics come from, like I said, over 100 years ago now. And when we look at them, I think there's some basic things that everybody, I think largely everyone agrees on now. Within the field of Bible, most historians, most Bible scholars, I think you'll find an agreement on these things within the mainstream. There are people outside of the mainstream who will disagree, but I think you'll find most mainstream scholars agree on these points. And I think before we jump in too far, this is going to help us as we analyze this question. So I want to talk about this. What are those points that will maybe help build some guardrails around our journey for the next couple of episodes? And then who were the form critics and what did they propose? All right, so number one, Jesus was a real person. And online is really one of the only places you find any real disagreement on that. Even skeptics like Bart Ehrman will agree that Jesus was clearly a real person. Within the mainstream of academia, that's what you see argued out there. There's not a lot of this idea of Jesus being a mythical figure really doesn't find a lot of mainstream acceptance out there. So Jesus was a real person, and he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, about 2,000 years ago. Again, non-controversial, one of the best attested historical facts out there from the ancient world. We have plenty of sources outside the Bible, and as we talked about a few episodes ago, we're not going to throw out biblical sources as well on these issues. That's a non-controversial historical fact. Jesus was a real person. He was crucified by the Romans. I think most historians you'll find, or biblical scholars will agree on that. Number two, and I want to be careful on this. We're going to avoid the why question, but after Jesus' death, his followers believed that they saw him physically resurrected. Now, why is in dispute? Okay, I'm not questioning that, and I'm not asking you to believe yet because he was raised from the dead. Let's not talk about why they believed that, but very clearly something happened, and they believed it. Now, their contention was that they saw him, spoke with him, ate dinner with him. They were able to touch his physically resurrected, healed body 3 days after being beaten to death and crucified by the Romans. And that's what scourging was. He was scourged and then he was crucified. Essentially, they beat him nearly to death and then they crucified him to finish the job. And just to be sure the crucifixion worked, they took a spear and they rammed it into his heart. So the Romans knew how to kill somebody. They were really good at that. So again, for whatever reason, Jesus' disciples believed that he had physically risen from the dead. And we're not just talking about 11 guys. We're talking about not only his female disciples, but Luke records for us that the number of disciples was actually about 120 followers, probably men at that point. So you would have had the 120 plus the female followers, plus, according to Paul, in one of the oldest Christian texts that we have out there, one of the oldest Christian traditions, that we have out there, records for us in 1 Corinthians 15 that that 500 brethren saw him at one time at one of his resurrection appearances. So we're not talking about a small number of people, and these would be the people who would start what today we know as the Christian church, okay? So these first two facts are not really in dispute. Now, a lot of people will dispute the why part. Obviously, if we all agreed it was because he physically raised from the dead, then I'm not sure what we're debating here. But again, so that's part of it. Number three, and I think we agree on the first two, there's some things that naturally fall into place, but for some reason they get lost in all of this discussion. Number three, this is the most important thing in the world to them. And their behavior is clearly going to identify that, because they are going to spread this message under the threat and the very reality of severe persecution and in some cases death. So this is the single most important thing to them. And it's different for us, because a lot of times we'll look at people and say, well, there's all sorts of people who do crazy things in the name of religion. That's true today when we've heard and believed something that we heard was true but didn't see. In the case of the disciples, in the case of Jesus' followers, they claim to have been there and seen it. And what that's going to do is put a very different spin on this as we go forward. So this was the most important thing to them. And number four, they suffered tremendous persecution up to the point of death. In some cases, standing by the story that Jesus had physically risen from the dead. They had seen him, they had spoke with him, they had touched his healed body, all of these things. Jesus went right after their doubt, looked at Thomas and said, hey, if you have any doubts, put your finger here in the nail prints. Put your hand here in the side where they rammed the spear into my side. I mean, Jesus addressed this very, very bluntly with the disciples. All right. So they firmly believe this. And again, we'll talk about the persecution from sources outside of the Bible when we get to that point. Number five should be very straightforward. But again, sometimes this is just forgotten. The eyewitnesses to Jesus' life and miracles, death and resurrection didn't suddenly disappear after he was raised from the dead, after he died. So Lazarus, whom the story goes famously from John, that Jesus physically raised Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus didn't just disappear. He didn't just go away instantly when all of this happened. There were other people that Jesus physically healed. Bartimaeus is a great example. He had been blind. Jesus physically healed him. Bartimaeus simply didn't just disappear after Jesus' death. One of the early church fathers addressed this. This is Eusebius quoting from Quadratus. He says, the works of our Savior were always present, for they were true. Those who were healed, those who rose from the dead, those who were not only seen in the act of being healed or raised, but were also always present, not merely when the Savior was living on the earth, but also for a considerable time after his departure, so that some of them survived even to our own times. That just makes logical sense. So the point of that being, there's going to be plenty of eyewitnesses around. Jesus lived 3 years performing this amazing ministry, and the people who had been touched by his ministry, not just his death and resurrection, but by his ministry beforehand, they didn't just disappear. That's going to be important for us later. And then number 6, the disciples of Jesus had disciples of their own. That's going to be crucially important for us down the road as we look at the claims that are made by the form critics going forward. Okay, so those 6 things, I don't think there's a lot of controversy to them. Again, the why part, yes, but these 6 facts I think are pretty straightforward, and I think most people would agree that most of these things are either clearly, I think most people would agree, most historians and Bible scholars within the mainstream would agree that these things are not debatable. I guess you can debate them, but these things are agreed upon by both sides of the argument. Now, the next question would be then, the form critics come on the scene about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago. And form criticism on its own is not a bad thing if it's used properly. So, for example, there are different genres, different styles of literature within the Bible. The book of Psalms is not historical. It's not written as a historical document. It's written as music. It's written as poetry. Song of Solomon is written as a rather spicy piece of adult poetry, describing a relationship between 2 lovers. So you've got prophetic writings, you've got historical writings, you've got poetry and song, you've got different things like that. And so it's important when you're reading through any document to understand, what am I reading? We do this today. if I go to Barnes Noble and I go buy a book and I buy a fictional book, well, I'm going to read that differently than if I buy a book that is a historical bibliography or historical biography, excuse me, not bibliography. But you want to know what you're reading, and that's important. And so if I understand what I'm reading and I get it right, then it's going to help me with the context of what I'm reading. That, I think, makes perfectly good sense to all of us. But you have authors who took that process to the New Testament. People like Schmidt, people like Bultmann, and others who used that process to try to analyze the New Testament and to break it down in a very different way. And the problem is how they approached it and what they did. And I think it's important to recognize that the form critics' methods and their conclusions have largely been rejected historically 100 years later by most of mainstream academia looking at this. Most of the conclusions that they've reached and most of the reasons behind those conclusions, people look at and go, well, that's not accurate. We know that now. And so what they would do is they would look at a piece of scripture and they would attempt to break it down in terms of its genre. And they would try then to figure out how it was passed down and what was done. Now, if you approach this from a better perspective, I think there's different ways you could have come up with this. And you'll find authors that do this today. Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, we're going to be quoting a lot from that. And Bauckham does something, I think, similar in a regard. He looks at the four Gospels written in what we better understand today as historical biographies of Jesus' life. That's the style of writing that they actually were. And so Bauckham approaches it from that perspective and says, what can we learn based on other historical works? That's kind of what the form critics did, but they did it in a very I want to really say it goes beyond skepticism, because what they did was to basically tear down any of the foundations by which we previously understood the Bible, and a lot of the biases and the assumptions that they brought into the process have simply historically been proven to be untrue at this point. And so what they would do would be to look at things and go, well, let's break down, how did we get this book actually here? So Mark, for example, as they looked at the book of Mark, what they would have said was, Mark's gospel seems to be comprised of short stories or sayings of Jesus. And these were in existence before Mark put them together. And Mark basically took these real short stories and he just kind of wove the rest of it together. So he kind of embellished, you might say, the rest of it together and kind of put it together to make it into more the form that we have today. And the Gospels really, in that regard, should be looked at and regarded as folk literature. So they're kind of, if we think about, tall tales and we think about, folk stories and things like that, fairy tales basically, nicer word, than fairy tales implies that they're just strictly untrue. But that's kind of the angle that when Schmidt looked at this, he went, yeah, that's really more what this was. These were more folk stories than they were anything else. And the ideas that come out of that, right away, there's huge problems associated with that, with what we know. What we know was Mark was the interpreter and the scribe, in essence, of Peter. Not scribe. Scribe's not the right word. He was Peter's interpreter and traveling companion there for a while. And so what Mark committed to writing, with Peter's help, and in addition, other people, no doubt, but what Mark committed to writing were Peter's memories of Jesus' life and ministry. And so he committed those things to writing. Now, Mark wouldn't have actually been there. So part of what Schmidt is getting at is correct. Mark has taken these short stories that Peter has given him, and he's woven them together. But what Schmidt does is he adds this enormous level of skepticism, almost to the point of cynicism, if we're being honest. And then starts tearing it all down, going, well, the foundational story might have been true, but... And then starts breaking down all the various pieces and the biases, the other assumptions that he brings to the table. And this is where we find a lot of these things come out of. Then completely proceed to tear down the work, even though they're contradicted by Matthew and Luke, the other two synoptic gospels, even though they're contradicted by what we know about other areas. We're going to talk about all of that next week. Even though we know these things, when you start weaving into it the idea, well, the Gospels were written much, 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 much later after Jesus lived. And the insinuation being there was really no eyewitnesses there. It's really not eyewitness accounts. They're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. We don't know when they were written. They're anonymous accounts of Jesus' life. And probably what happened was these were folk tales that were passed on from village to village, and they really weren't very careful with it. Going back to the telephone game and things like that, they really weren't that careful with it. And probably what the early church would have done is they really weren't what Jesus said. They were like Jesus style. So Jesus might have said something like, hey, you guys should, love one another. And then the church communities would take that and they kind of shape it a little bit and twist it. And it might have been a square peg going in a round hole, but they kind of round it off and put that square peg that's now round into the right hole. And they'd make it fit for what they wanted to use it for. So there wasn't ever really a focus on getting the story right. They just kind of used Jesus' sayings as, helpful stories to, get their kids to go to bed on time or whatever it might be. They just use these Jesus-style sayings, and that's what we have today. And that would be the idea. They certainly weren't the product of eyewitness testimony. The truth of what actually happened was lost long ago, and we just don't have any access to it. We don't have any idea. Again, you hear Bart Ehrman and others saying things like that. The anonymous part, we don't know what was really written, that kind of stuff. And it raises the standard impossibly high. And what you do is you throw this enormous skepticism or cynicism over everything Jesus said, and you effectively tear down the entire gospel. You have to ignore what the early church fathers wrote, even though they were there. And the part that gets me is the absolute sheer lack of respect that this shows to the people that were there. I understand there's some skepticism, and we'll talk a little bit more about this idea, this snobbery that we have today, that anybody that lived more than 100 years ago, or anybody that lived more than, let's be honest, anybody who grew up before the year 2000 has no idea what they're talking about or anything like that. We've talked a little bit about that in the last few episodes. This idea of looking back and completely discounting what the early church fathers, the disciples, and the followers of Jesus lived and died for, to me is really offensive, because these people literally gave everything for something. And if on one hand, they really didn't care and they just kind of clumsily passed these stories along, then why was it that they were willing to be persecuted and die for these sayings? Why was it that they were willing to go to the ultimate sacrifice to pass on these things, to change their lives? If you look at someone like Saul of Tarsus, we know him as Paul the Apostle. But if you look at Saul of Tarsus, man, Saul's got the church on the run. By Christian accounts, Saul is wiping the church out. He launches this massive persecution of the church, and then he meets the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. And it changes him completely, and he goes from being the persecutor of the church, driving the church out of existence, to the greatest apostle that the church would ever see, spreading the gospel more than maybe anybody else in history. How did that happen? And the problems that you find when you look at the ideas of the form critics is they really do rapidly fall apart under any close cross-examination. Now, I say this having the benefit of 100 years of academic work that's gone into tearing down these arguments of the form critics. I had no part in that. I'm simply the recipient of that 100 years worth of work that's gone into tearing down those ideas of the form critics. But we are going to talk at length about that in the next episode. I think it's really important that we address these questions and look at this. Like I said, I think Bauckham looks at that, and in one of his quotes, he says, "It's a curious fact that nearly all the contentions of the early form critics have by now been convincingly refuted. But the general picture of the process of oral transmission that form critics pioneered still governs the way most New Testament scholars think." And that's where we're going to find problems in this, is some of the ideas that they've embedded in culture have persisted up until now. And if we're being consistent and we really look at these things, what we're going to find is the ideas that they brought to the table, this idea that, well, Mark really was just kind of a few sayings that were basically brought together in a story doesn't really work when you actually look back on everything else around it. So what I want to do before we get much further into this in this episode, we're going to save the rest of this analysis for next time, okay? I wanted to get this out there. I wanted to get the form critics' ideas out there. And then next time we're going to answer the question, well, are they right? Do they actually have a point? When he looks at it and says, remember, this is what we're going to talk about. Mark's gospel seems to be comprised of short stories or sayings of Jesus. And really, they're probably more, Jesus style rather than actual things that he said. And Mark basically took those from whatever source he got them from, or whoever really put them together, because it probably wasn't Mark. And they just kind of wove them together, and they kind of filled in the blanks. They kind of added the interesting parts. And they kind of put it all together to where it made up a story. And basically, the Gospels are just folk stories that have been cleverly put together and then put out there like this. You really can't believe what you're reading. There's some truth buried in there, but it's buried awfully deep. And it makes Jesus into, well, he was just a great teacher. And these are kind of his sayings that, that moved out of that area. Is that really true? Is that what actually happened? And next time, we're going to jump on that, and we're going to talk a lot about whether or not that's right. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the podcast and the subscribe button. I'm sorry, the like button for the episode, subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. You can find helpful information on our website at prooftograce.com. And if you've got questions, if you've got comments, anything you want to throw out there, I don't always read what goes in the comments section, so take that into consideration. But if you've got an actual question you'd like me to answer, please reach out at prooftograce@yahoo.com via email, and I am happy to try to answer questions that come in. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.